And then, of course, here we have Laura Conway.
Hello.
Yeah. In person, who is also my colleague at the department. And
True story.
I remember when you were shooting this film, and it's the second time I've had a chance to see it. You did some work since the last time.
Yeah, a couple of changes, fine tuning, sound mix,
Yeah,
stuff like that. Yeah,
really interesting. Are we good now, or are you going to let me know? Oh, we're good. Okay. Hi, Camilla. Hi. Is it Essie?
Essie, right?
Yes. Welcome. My name's Emily. I'm moderating today, and this is Laura, who is also a filmmaker in your program.
Hi there.
Hi, everyone. Hi.
So I believe they can see you as well as us, correct? I haven't actually, this is so top notch here. Let's once again just give everyone a round of applause for their films today. So we started with Camilla and we ended with Essie, and Laura was in the middle. And I felt that there were so many threads with this program that connected the films together. Camilla, I was looking at your website and your bio, and you talked a little bit about this idea of resistance and stories from the past and our inability to change the past, but to write new narratives into the future. And I felt all three of these films really sort of were exploring that idea. So I was wondering if you could first talk a little bit about this idea, and all three of you, this idea of resistance in your filmmaking.
Sure. Thank you. It's great to be here again, although I wish I could be here with you, in person. But thank you again for programming the film in such wonderful company, too. I thought the films were beautiful and the program was very strong. The idea of resistance, I think what I say on my website in particular is that I use empathy as a form of resistance. And I think my practice to date has been and continues to be very relational. So it's very much based in building relationships with people. So it's not that kind of fast pace of, making a film. Is usually a film that takes quite a long time. I started this particular film back in 2016. And I've been returning to Morocco, to this small village of Sefrou, or small town of Sefrou, all the way until February this year, actually. So yeah, that kind of idea of having community of people working together towards a particular outcome, I think that's creative, that's very participatory, is something that I think I see very much as a form of resistance in relation to ways in which films are made, or even documentary films are made, particularly the ones that are on a larger scale.
Right. So this idea of co-authorship, which really comes across from the very beginning of your film. Laura, you also mentioned resistance in your artist bio.
Pointing me back to myself. Just kidding.
Yeah.
I think, is this working? Yeah. I think I was talking about this earlier, that I was thinking about humor and absurdity and like camp, which is sort of, using gender, the like stereotypes, and then pushing them like to their most extreme, to the point where you can kind of have fun with them, that you can both like critique and enjoy.
Find that text and did you immediately think, oh, I want to make something from this?
Yeah, it's funny. I made this piece in response to a prompt that was given to me at the studio where I have, or the gallery where I have a studio, and the prompt was for entropic film, or something about roots, and I'm like very literal minded, terrible at metaphors, and so I was like, cool, plants, and then I was just doing all this looking into just looking at different texts, and it brought me to these 19th century gardening advice columns, and they were just very strange. These gardening advice columns, they were like early self-help texts that were marketed to women. Some of the earliest self-help texts, some of the earliest books marketed to women as well, specifically to women. And they're just the gender scripts that are, you know, the ideologies that are in those texts are just hilarious. Like that you should catch tuberculosis if you get a little too sturdy working in your garden, like, you know, how similar women are to flowers naturally, like just all this funny ideology. And so I basically just quoted many of those texts, and that was my jumping off point.
And then Essie, your film, which is so beautiful and so moving, and it you know, the waves of the text and the dual channel, the images, but then close to the end, there is this sort of healing that seems to be taking place in the narrative, if one can call it a narrative. Do you feel like there's an act of resistance in this work for you? And were you looking to write a new narrative?
Yeah, I think I'm resisting the idea of history as this moment that's frozen in time way back when, and thinking about it as something that is continuing. Thinking about how we're all in some way trapped in these choreographies that are not of our choosing. And going back to that, how can we move forward? How can we undo that? How can we move in a way that we are free? So I think that was a big impetus in this.
Well, interesting you bring up this idea of choreographies, because music and movement, moving bodies, dance, these were elements that were included in all of the films. Can you talk a little bit about that, including that in your work, Essie?
Sure. Yeah, it started with the lead of the film, Christina. I met her in a meeting at Filipino Advocates for Justice, this organization in Oakland that's been working with exploited workers for decades. I was shooting her in this mansion, in this rented house, and just sort of how she daily worked. And she mentioned how her employer would punish her for staying still. She had to always kind of keep this idea that she was working at all times. And I found that really interesting, and it started to inform my stylistic choice to keep the camera always moving. And later in the Philippines, when I was filming the devotional dances to this statuette that Magellan brought over, I was thinking about this devotional dance to the child and how it's this continuation. Domestic work is a way of lifting people out of poverty that's been more effective than any government aid that the women are doing themselves at a high cost of the sacrifice of their entire lives. But there is this likeness to a dance in it for me. I slowed it down too so that we could really see the skill involved in the labor, because I feel like that's often overlooked in domestic work.
Well, Laura, I mean, it reminds me of your newer project, this idea of movement, but then also how you incorporate dance into all of your films. And I noticed that you were one of the dancers. Yes. So can you talk a little bit about your use of movement and dance in your films?
Yeah, I think recently I'm just like being resourceful with what's around me and the talented people around me. And right now, those people are musicians and dancers. And so actually Ben Donahauer's here, did the score, all of the music in the film, which is amazing. Thank you. And but I know so many talented dancers, and so I'm just like, what can I make with what I have? And so that's one of the things. And that's also why I was noticing also in the other pieces, there's a lot of a cappella singing in everyone's work too, which was so beautiful. And yeah, the choreographer and lead Elle is a beautiful dancer and also a great singer. And so that's why I brought the singing in too, because I was just like, I'm not going to not have you sing because you're amazing. So yeah, obviously I'm going to have you sing. Anyway, that's.
Well, and dance is a way to create a playful environment and to communicate some of your ideas, I think, as well.
Yeah, totally. And maybe like all the other stuff is just an excuse to get the dance going. You know, I think that might be true for most of my work.
So Camilla, I found the musical interludes in your work as a space to sort of process what was happening and some of the information that was happening. And was that your intention with it? And I mean, music can just function in that way in life in general.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very glad that that worked for you that way. It was intentional in that way, but it was also a very important component of how Fatima and I related to one another, and also how really myself and other women interacted. There was always a lot of playfulness. Moroccan people in general have a very wicked, very cheeky sense of humor, which I really love. And there was a lot of dancing, there was a lot of music, and there was a lot of singing. And strangely enough, even though Fatima herself didn't like the sound of her own voice, she was singing a lot. So I wanted that joy to be in the film, because although the stories that the women shared with me, and there were many of them, were really very, very difficult to process for myself, for the small crew that I had. But there was also a lot of joy, and there was a sense of maybe healing is too big a word, but there was a sense of ownership over these stories and just moving forward and moving on with life. That was very much the spirit, and I think the music in the film helps with that, to convey that spirit of that. Yeah.
So I have some more questions, but we can also open it up to anyone in the theater. And I think we have a microphone. So if you have a question, Toma can bring the microphone to you. Eric.
Hello. Hi, Camilla. So nice to see
Hi,
you.
Eric. Lovely to see you too.
And thanks for repping Mimesis.
Yay.
Love the shirt. They're for sale on the
How could I not?
$5 a piece. I think all of the work that you have presented, all three of you have presented today, are obviously deeply engaged with the ethical problems of our world, but they also seem to be deeply engaged with the ethical problems of representational media in general, and in a way they kind of self-critique in order to engage with the ethical problems of the world. And I just wonder what you found to be the most challenging ethical components of making these projects, how you navigated those challenges, and whether or not you feel like you succeeded in navigating that. I mean, Camilla, I think maybe to start us off, you have a very reflexive moment, right, where you consider turning the camera off and your subject asks you to keep it on. And it brings that question of like, is that subject's agency to say keep recording, is that a good enough reason to keep recording, right? Like, is that, does that give you the excuse to go on or not? And how do you navigate that?
Well, and
Thank
also
you.
just to add to that, this idea of consent, which really came across strongly in the work. So,
And the entire program.
yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, very much so. That was definitely a question that particularly another Fatima, who was our translator, and I had. And I guess one thing that I would say, that the way the film is constructed, which I'm sure all of you have noticed, is that Fatima speaks in Darija and I respond in English in the film. And of course, that's heavily constructed. And one of the reasons for that is that our relationship was heavily mediated by translations. There was always a translator between Fatima and I. And although I have learned enough basic Darija to communicate with the women for the time I was always there, it wasn't really enough to have a deep conversation. So there's a reason for that. And the camera moment, I've had many of those throughout the filming. And I think Fatima was an incredible spirit that way. She told me from the very beginning is that, first of all, I had to explain to her what I was planning to do with the film. And she said, well, I'm not going to share my story with you unless you do something with it. So you've got to show it somewhere. We had to explain to her that it isn't going to be a TV. The conception of an artist's moving image or film in Morocco doesn't exist. So it's either TV or really mainly TV. So we had to explain to her what the festival is, how people engage with the work. And she said, well, I'll share that story with you. But only on the condition that, you tell it through the way I say it. And there are moments in, her script, if you'd like, that but I had struggled with a little bit, but I decided to leave them as they were, because these are her words and this is her story. And I think, but there were lots of questions around that. And as to your question, whether Fatima urging me to continue filming is enough of an excuse, I'm not sure that excuse is necessarily the word there. I think that was, in fact, it was her idea to make the film. And I think I just went along with it, and I didn't really know, I didn't know what it would become. And I think I just want to give a big shout to Elizabeth Lowe here, who is the film's editor, who I think did a fantastic job and helped to bring the film to that other slightly more, I don't know, metaphysical level, if you'd like. And I think, yeah, I'm going to stop there, and then maybe I'll jump in a bit later.
I mean, just to quickly follow up on that, do you feel that maybe doing this kind of work, doing this kind of filmmaking, this kind of artistic practice can be a service to a community, to a person, to a story, and do you approach it in that way? Because we often think of it as expression, right, coming like somehow from within us, rather than as a service to another.
Yeah, this is a great question, because I still haven't shown the film in Morocco. I went there in February this year to sort of lay the ground for showing the film. And there's a lot of questions around sharing that work back with the community, because it can have a different effect on the women engaging with the film. And, whereas here we might have a group of, support workers on the ground, the therapists on the ground. Here I'll go and show the film and then disappear the following week. And then there might be repercussions for the women who have seen and engaged with the film, who have also participated in the film. So at the moment, I'm working with a couple of organizations on creating conditions for the film to be shown in that way, that we feel would be serving the community, as opposed to potentially maybe re-traumatizing is too big a word, but perhaps stirring up emotions that there's no container for in the actual society. Yeah.
Yeah, and Essie, your use of this kind of double aspect and this dual language felt like a response to an ethical dilemma in some way. I don't know if that is what it was, but that's how it kind of felt to me watching it, and I wonder how you thought about that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, the language, I thought that was purely for sort of a audio experience. I was thinking initially just to sort of feel the way that someone speaks in their native language versus the foreign language, and sort of the way that they move through that is another meaning of movement. But I think for me, the big ethical dilemma was making this project in the first place. I wouldn't have done it without the collaboration of Filipino advocates for justice, particularly my producer, Nurjana Kalim, who was the daughter of a domestic worker, and Christina, the lead, who was trafficked into our country. And a number of people I interviewed were trafficked, and this was made during the prior administration. So ICE fears were running pretty high. And so I decided, for everyone's safety, it would be a conglomeration of stories, no one's particular story, no particular details about how they got here or why they got here. But there were commonalities in all of them that I sort of put together and had different people play. So yeah, that was a huge ethical dilemma, especially in the age of facial recognition technology, all of these things, of how to do this. And I had to really have some serious discussions with the people involved about how they felt about their own safety. And yeah, they agreed to it, but it's always something to be of concern in things like this. Yeah.
I think it worked. I don't know how everyone else felt, but I do think it worked in terms of bringing those stories together in one voice. And did you always imagine it in the format that its final format? And have you shown it as a video installation or in other spaces?
Yeah, I've shown it as a video installation. I think that was my initial impetus, because I wanted the two sound channels to create different sound environments. So if you're walking around it, you can sort of choose to be more in the Philippines or choose to be more in the US. And I think it's interesting to watch people move around and kind of see it from her perspective, from her language, and then go to the other side and see it from the foreign perspective. So yeah, that was, yeah.
So Laura, to Eric's first question, I think this idea of, you submitted this film to Mimesis, yes?
Yes.
So pushing the boundaries of what nonfiction is, and
yeah, I think you were talking about the politics of representation or what, and I feel like something I'm working with here a lot is beauty. So I feel conflicted about beauty in this film. And I'm kind of like responding to it through camp. So excess, the colors are like almost pretty, but they're kind of too saturated. So they kind of border on like gaudy. And I feel the same way about some of the, ballet, which is beautiful, obviously, but kind of over the top and has, I feel like in a lot of ways, perpetrated some violence against women in the terms of, the way people think about their bodies and staying super thin, and it's not uncomplicated. So that kind of beauty, and so there's like just a little bit of, I feel conflicted about beauty in the film and how we're engaging with it. As far as the nonfiction element, I do think this project started in the same way I would start like a nonfiction project or a documentary project, which is with like, a source text. And of course, that might be true for a narrative project as well. I'm really excited about the way, I just feel like especially the way Mimesis thinks of it, I feel like documentary or nonfiction is just like such a expansive place to think. And I don't know about the genre specifically, but just as a way of like thinking about art, I find it very freeing.
I generally think shorter is better, but I have to say with your film, it could have gone longer for me. I almost could see it as a full feature with different interludes and things going on. So it might be a longer project.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, right here we have a question.
Thanks, Eric. I have a question for Camilla. Hi, Camilla. This is a nerdy filmmaker question for all the filmmakers in the room. I really loved your use of Super 8 in the film, and it was really heartwarming to see the Nizo being passed around among the women. And I'm curious how you went about integrating Super 8 into the project, and the seagull image. Was that planned out? Was it found in the editing? How I'm thinking of this shot with the seagulls in the door frame and stuff like that. So I'm curious.
Thank you. I love the nerdy filmmaker questions. What I did before we started filming was actually I spent a couple of weeks with the women using cameras. The original project was that I explained to them very briefly how to use the portable Ilford 35mm cameras, and left it with them for a couple of weeks, and they took pictures of themselves, of their surroundings, whichever way they wanted. And then when we met for a few days to film, mostly on walks, different excursions, I brought my niece, so I brought my Super 8, and suddenly Fatima said, like, well, what is that? Can you show me how to use that? So there's two Fatimas there. There's Fatima bin Musa, who is a wheelchair user, who you see a couple of times in the film holding the camera. And there's the main Fatima. And the main Fatima has only partial vision, so she couldn't really see through the viewfinder very well. So she would just point the camera, whatever she wanted to point the camera at. And it was my understanding that she really developed a certain relationship with that object and with the Super 8 camera. So it was important for me that the camera itself, which is to some degree a character in the film as well. And of course, there's this vision metaphor of the eye, which Elizabeth, the editor, came up with. And the Super 8, the use of the Super 8 in the film, I actually had 3 more cartridges of Super 8 that we shot, but unfortunately 3 days later our house got burgled and we're in Morocco, and that particular Nizo was actually gone. So I have replaced it since, but yeah, there was some more footage that was in my bag that got stolen. But the seagull comes from another Super 8 footage that I filmed somewhere else, and it was Elizabeth's idea to integrate it into the film in a way that she did. In fact, most of the montages in the film that you see, maybe I'll just say a word about the question of choreography. There is choreography there. There's a sequence towards the end of the film, which is that of us walking, or myself walking with the women, and I see it very much as a piece that's kind of like a choreographed montage. That's how Elizabeth and I talked about that. that moment in the film. And so yeah, but the seagull was very much something that was Elizabeth's vision, which I very much loved, because that also related to Fatima's words when she talked about having that feeling of being a bird and being free and flying around. So yeah, that's where that idea came from. But yeah,
Can I
thank
ask
you
a
for the
question to you, Camila? I was so both of your films were just so beautiful to look at. And I was wondering, Camila, about that like layer on your film. It was just so like interesting to look at, so goopy and enigmatic. I was just like, how did you make that? How did you choose to, like, did you know you needed something that on top, and were you like just trying things out until you found that? Or yeah, would you talk about that?
Yeah, thank you. I was trying things out on my own, very unsuccessfully. And I think one day I was basically, I should say that I was never really planning for a long time. I wasn't really planning to make that film until Fatima really threw that idea up in the air. And that was 3 visits into Morocco, by which time I've collected some footage for a slightly different project, which then never happened. So I had this lots of material, but I didn't exactly know how to put it together. And Elizabeth, who's herself a great filmmaker, watched my sort of work in progress, and she said, "Do you mind if I have a go at it?" And I was like, "Knock yourself out." Because at that point I was also so close to the project emotionally that I really couldn't see the, whatever. And I was also working on the first feature film, so it was like I was all over the place. So we started talking a little bit, and suddenly I think Elizabeth said that there's Fatima's partial vision, there's this ongoing thing about the eye, and then she said, well, we started talking about Derek Jarman's Blue. I don't know if you have seen Derek Jarman's Blue, that made towards the end of his life, when he died of AIDS, and towards the end of his life he was losing his vision, and the film is just this blue screen and him talking over it. And I think that's where that blue hue in the film came, that sort of became really the mood of the film in so many ways too. Yeah.
It's interesting you just mentioned Derek Jarman, because I was thinking for Essie that your film reminded me a little bit of some of Isaac Julian's work. Do you know his work?
Very much so. Yeah, no,
Okay.
I love the Black Audio Collective. They're great.
Yeah. Any other questions? We have 2 here.
Everyone, beautiful films. Hi, Camila. Hi, Essie. Hi, Laura. Hi, Emma. I want to talk about translation. I think everybody has some version of translation. Specifically, Camila, one of the incidents involves looking at the translator and communicating. I'm already curious what had been translated at that moment and how did that come about. Laura, you have translation and kind of this historical, maybe dialectal, generational, and also creative sense. And then Essie, which came first, the Tagalog or the English?
And then let's just tag on the use of text too, and how that's a part of the translation and sometimes delivers some of the more difficult information to the audience through text. Let's start with Laura.
Okay, great. I'm thinking about translation. The first thing that I'm thinking about is the dances that we choreographed and kind of stitching those together. We started, because we recorded the music after the film was made. Ben and I put together a collage of songs that were like the right tone that we were going for and kind of tempo. Some were from Valerie and Her Week of Wonders. Some were from like Swan Lake, very classic. I'm trying to remember some of the other ones. So we made this little audio collage, and then we choreographed the dance to those. And then, we threw all those away, and then Ben had to write songs that were at the exact tempo as those original songs, and kind of use those as like tone ideas. And so I think that was an interesting translation element, was because that's not, a normal way to make music. If you were going to choreograph to something, you would write the music first and then choreograph a dance to that. So I thought that was an interesting part of the process.
And also this idea of translating the past vernacular to the present, and kind of in this campy style, and Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think a lot of that was just, and I've done this before from other projects. It's just like sometimes all you have to do is just say what other people have said, and it just sounds crazy. Like just quote it directly, or just like put it on screen, the exact words, and sometimes that's just, yeah. So we did a lot of quoting. I mean, I would say we augmented some of the lines that are in the dialogue. And then also, of course, like the meaning comes from the collision of the images and the words. So talking about your hedges does not do a lot unless you're looking at an image of pubic hair being trimmed at the same time. So that's like where the meaning comes from. So I think that was maybe the translation or the updating is the images that you put with these hilarious excerpts.
Essie, do you remember the question? It was
Yeah.
which came first? Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually a language called Visayan that's native to the middle and southern islands, Mindanao area, which is where Christina is from. And so it's a dialect you don't hear very often because Tagalog is the more popular one. But that was a very specific choice because a lot of domestic workers come from the Visayas, and even within the Philippines, another word for domestic term is, my Visaya instead of my domestic worker. So that was important to include that language. And I remember talking with my translator / ground producer, Nurj, and that's her native language as well. She speaks so many languages. And she's a big fan of poetry. And that was really important to me in the translation, that I could work with someone who could really distill the words down to their essence. And there was some back and forth with her and Christina of like what felt right in the actual audio recording. But I really trusted her with that. And that was super important. And also with the two languages on screen too, I thought it was really interesting to see the fragments of Spanish within the language, which has always been interesting to me, hearing it in, my mother speaks Tagalog, and so I could hear it in her language. And it just kind of reminds me of the pieces of porcelain that still wash up. It's just these fragments of history that stay in the language and are still kind of kept alive. So visually, I really liked having it on screen at the same time as well.
Camilla, you talked a little bit about this already, but do you have more to add?
Yeah, maybe I'll just say that I do have another version of the film that does have Darija and Arabic subtitles. There is a bit of a confusion around Darija in this particular region of Morocco because no translator can ever agree on how particular words are spelled. Because it's a language that's continuously developing, is very contemporary in many ways, very alive. So that was the difficulty of that. Plus, also many women who lived in that care home, the Amazigh women, they speak their own Amazigh version of Darija, and they don't actually understand or neither they can read Arabic. So there's a lot of there was a lot of difficulties there creating that other version of the film. But I think what's also interesting, I think maybe in Essie's film as well, is the idea of how do you sort of translate somebody else's experience onto a screen, and what constructs do you use to achieve that? And I've always liked that quote by Andre Bazin, which I'm going to paraphrase very badly, that sometimes in order to get to the truth, you have to employ some artifice. In other words, of course, everything is a construct, right? And we are responsible for constructing that image or that narrative or non-narrative. And I think there's definitely a lot of questions that I have had to myself around the translating Fatima's story, given our differences, geography, and me being a person I come from and Fatima being a person where she comes from. I think it still raises a lot of questions. Yeah.
Well, it seems like there's a thread of poetry as well for all of these films as a way to translate an experience. I mean, Camilla, you end with this poetic moment.
Yeah, if I may add, of course, that's Rashida Madani's poem, or part of Rashida Madani, who is a Moroccan human rights activist, but particularly focused on women's rights. It's been an amazing ally in a project and a brilliant supporter. And in the early days of early versions of the film, I shared with her some images from the film that actually had a text written directly on the image in a typewriter, which we also used with the women as part of the project. But again, that was something I didn't use in the film in the end. And she really liked it. But then I decided that there should be no text on the screen and it should be a voiceover. And she wrote me back saying, thank God that you decided to do that, because the poem for her had a completely different resonance when it was sort of spoken in English. And the poem exists only in French and English because she writes in French. So yeah, but that's Rashida Madani's poem, which I encourage everyone to check out. A lot of her writings. She's an incredible poet. Yeah.
Can we go with this one last question? Okay, unfortunately, it's been so wonderful to speak with all three of you, and we have to wrap up now. But thank you for joining us here in Boulder and for sharing your work with us. Let's give everyone a round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily.
A lot of